Hi Miss, my name is Justin Jeffrey and today I'll be presenting to you my research project. So first, I'd just like to say that this is a topic that I chose because I've always been fascinated by architecture. I went to Europe when I was in secondary 5, about 16 years old, and I've always been fascinated with architecture. So when we decided that it would be like the theme of the course would be home, I was really excited because I knew I was going to do something either architectural or like that had to do with like altitudes and if that affected like wealth and social classes. But I chose to do architecture because it was probably like my biggest passion out of the two. So my project was about Gothic architecture versus Victorian architecture. So two different eras. The Gothic era, sorry, stretching from the 12th century to the 16th century, and Victorian era stretching from early 19th century to, late 19th century and early 20th century. So from about 1820 to about 1902. One obviously very much longer than the other, so there's a lot more stuff I could talk about for the Gothic era and Gothic architecture, but nonetheless, two very popular styles that I was able to research and talk about. So the first thing that I learned, which was not shocking, but that I didn't really know, is that the Gothic style is pretty much any church or cathedral that you see in Montreal is derived from the Gothic era, which makes sense because the French took Montreal and discovered Montreal and made it a city in 1642, I believe. So it makes sense that the French colonizers would come over here, bring architects that would design churches and cathedrals. So like Notre Dame de Basilica is a Gothic style church. St. Joseph's Oratory is a Gothic style church. Victorian architecture is more seen through houses. Not so much in Montreal, more in Toronto, but we'll talk about that a bit later. So what I learned about Gothic architecture is the structural details of it. So a couple things that characterize the Gothic architecture style is big domes. So you could see it a lot in like Italy is like the domes, rib vaults, which is like the structural. So like the big dome, rib vaults are the diagonal structure that goes around and surrounds it. This allows, this means that the walls on the cathedrals, sorry, I'm a bit nervous, but the walls on the cathedrals could be a lot thinner, which would provide the use of windows, which you couldn't have in cathedrals before. They were solid, not much natural light coming through, and if you did, you had one window at the back. This way, the whole cathedral could be lined with windows, and you could have stained glass, so a lot more natural light coming through. Since the structure was so strong because of these rib vaults, you could have a lot of windows and stained glass. This also meant that you could have tracery, which is the division between the windows into like little subsections, and you could have little colors for the stained glass, so when the light would shine through, that'd be very pretty. Another thing is the high towers in the exterior of the churches and cathedrals. This so like the whole goal of like stained glass and high towers and big domes and what's it called, high arches, this would help the visibility of the cathedrals and the churches. So this means that the wealthy, like the church was very wealthy back in the day in the Gothic era. This meant that they wanted to show off their power. Like the church was almost as strong as the government is now. So they ran like education, finances, everything almost. So what that means is that they wanted to flaunt their wealth and show how powerful they were. So the Gothic era was characterized by like wanting to show who's richer and who's poor. And during this time, there was a big gap forming between the working class, so like pretty much slaves and like low-level workers and farmers, and the very rich. So they talk about a wage gap now between the rich and the poor, but back then it was even worse. So that's the era they lived in. It was really trying to show that there's a big difference in wealth and who's powerful and who's not. So the goal was to be flamboyant with the churches and cathedrals. And in the architecture, that's how you showed who had money and who didn't. The Victorian era is a little bit different. So since Queen Victoria ruled from 1837 to 1901, during this time it was like the middle of the Industrial Revolution, or the beginning of it, sorry. of the Industrial Revolution. So there was a lot of social reform, financial reform. So what was introduced was unions, and it's present in a show I'm watching now, actually, Peaky Blinders. But the unions were taking over, which would mean that the gap that was present in the Gothic era between like low-level workers and the rich would actually start to be closing during that time. So they fought for women's equal pay in factories and better working conditions, and unions which would protect the working class, which was so underpaid and had terrible living conditions. So that was the era of the Victorian era. So it's like two opposite times. So one was increasing the gap of wealth, and one was trying to close it. So two different cultures. Same, sorry, I didn't mention that the Gothic era was mostly in France. It originated in France and then spilled over to England, but the actual architectural style started in France, and the Victorian style is actually derived from the Gothic style. They call it the Neo-Gothic style, or the post-Renaissance Goth style. So very similar in the fact that they both have stained glass. The main difference in the materials they use is that the Victorian architecture style also had rib vaults, which is those big domes and diagonal things to support the walls so that it's sturdier. But one thing that the Victorian era had that the Gothic era didn't was the use of steel, due to the Industrial Revolution, and people could start making sturdier materials, and they could produce it at like a faster and wider rate. So you could have more of it quicker, and it was just easier to build at that time. So they could build these big churches that would never collapse. And there were structural failures, which were then later reviewed, but not in the Gothic era. A lot of structural failures in the Gothic era. Sorry, let me just review the questions. Another thing I learned is that the Victorian era was characterized by what is symmetry, Paladine symmetry, which you could see in Roman architecture, but the Victorian era kind of took it from the Roman era. It was that you'd have like 4 pillars, and then the rest of it would be equal. So you'd have like a big structure here, so like a house-like structure, and then the 2 would come out like that. And when you watch like these shows on Netflix that are like historical, those are usually the houses that are there. Is that you have these the structure signifying the front of the house, and then 2 long stretches, which would be like the rest of the rooms and stuff. But the symmetry is really what they focused on in the Victorian era. They also had stained glass, tracery, so they took that from the Gothic era. But yeah, there were some differences. So what I took mostly from it is that I came into it thinking that those were 2 completely different eras and architectural styles, and they are completely different eras. It's not the same at all. 2 different places, 2 different cultures, and 2 different political events. How should I say that? Like political climate at the time. Different revolutions, different things, but they're actually very similar in their architectural style, one deriving from the other, because the Gothic style ended up going to England in the late 15th century, I believe, towards the end of the Gothic era in France, and then it was reborn in the Victorian era. So what I learned is that they're not completely different. It's 2 of the same architectural styles, just one performed better than the other, and there were some a little differences, but yeah, so that's pretty much what I learned. I integrated the social science disciplines, so the major one being history. History, obviously, so I could give you background. I could give you the background on the Gothic era and Gothic architecture, Victorian era, and that architecture. So history was the most important one, so I could give you context on what the era was and why that affected and why what was going on affected the actual architecture of that specific time. So history being the major one. The study of culture usually falls in the anthropology subset of the social science disciplines. So I did use anthropology because I had to provide cultural references and explain how culture affected architecture, which is anthropology. One thing I used, it was very subtle. It was a couple lines, but it was psychology. I had to describe what the political climate and what people were thinking at the time, like the poor workers that they wanted to revolt. So I had to use a little bit of psychology. Yeah, those are the three social science disciplines that I used for the essay. I didn't do the peer review. I handed it in late, so I didn't receive any feedback. The changes I made for the final paper were I was missing some quotes, and a lot of my sources were properly done. Academic journals, I pulled a lot from them, but some of them, like one of them was like solely structures of tall houses in Ireland that derived from the Victorian era, and that there was no writing. It was just a source that showed me like the different levels and the details in the house, so it was tough to pull a quote from that. But I don't believe that I cited it, but I put it, like I used the knowledge from that, and that I just briefly mentioned it in my essay. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being a great teacher. And I hope this was okay. Thank you.